Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Warren Boykin, and I'm the Program and Outreach Coordinator for NAMI Northern Illinois. And today it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar on secondary trauma with our guest speaker, Jay Cangialosi. Uh, give you a little bit of background and a little bit of information on our upcoming session. Um, of course, this is available through our website. We have a calendar on our website, www.naminorthernillinois.org. And just a little bit about Jay. Jay Cangialosi is a licensed clinical professional counselor and dedicated therapist at Relief Mental Health in Oak Brook, Illinois, with more than a decade of experience in the field of mental health. Jay brings a wealth of knowledge and a compassionate approach to her practice. Jay earned a master's degree in counseling from Argosy University in Schaumburg, Illinois, and holds a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Eastern Illinois University. Beyond her personal life, she enjoys indulging in escape rooms, solving intricate puzzles and games, and watching Marvel movies. Uh, let's see, Jay is more than a therapist. She's a caring guide on your journey towards a happier, healthier life. And if you're seeking support and a safe space to explore personal growth and healing, Jay welcomes you to come as you are and take your first steps toward positive change. Just another word about her extensive background in therapy. It has equipped her with the skills to address a wide range of mental health diagnoses. She specializes in anxiety, depression, coping skills, self-esteem, insomnia, and sleep problems, as well as stress management and more, offering valuable support to those navigating these complex conditions. Jay is comfortable and experienced in working with individuals across diverse sexual orientations, including LGBTQ plus identities. So I just want to mention a word about our CEUs. Uh, CEUs are available for social work, counseling, marriage and family therapy, psychology, and nursing, sponsored by Rosecrans. And those evaluations and CEU credits will be offered at the end, after the conclusion of the session. All right, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jay.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. Appreciate all of that. And thank you all for spending your lunch hour with me here today. Forgive me and be patient with me as I kind of go back and forth between a couple of screens here. Right, we are here to discuss recognizing and addressing secondary trauma. Before we get into all of that, I do want to mention that I have allotted a specific amount of time at the end of the presentation to answer any questions that come up for you, any discussion that you want to bring to the table. So I am going to ask that for the sake of timing, to make sure that we stay within the hour, that you do keep those questions and comments, etc., to the end of our session here. You can throw it in the chat, that's fine, just so that we don't like lose it or whatnot. But just so you know, I'm not going to be able to navigate stopping and asking any of those questions. So we'll keep all of those to the end. Yes.
We could also have them put the questions in the Q&A box and we can address those at the end.
That works as well. That works as well. Whatever is easiest and most efficient for everybody. So that works for us. All right. So yeah, today's topic really is unfortunately a necessary one for we clinicians to discuss, right? Recognizing and addressing secondary trauma is really essential to our repertoire as helpers so that we can ensure that we're doing well for ourselves so that we can do well for others as well. That iteration there, right? So as Warren said, my name is Jay Cangialosi, and I am a therapist and the clinical development coordinator with Relief Mental Health. I do have over a decade of therapeutic experience in a lot of different capacities. And I would say that that has lended me to hearing my own fair share of some of the more traumatic narratives that I've heard, even from the earliest portions of my own career, which I started off working as at an employee assistance program as a therapist. And I'm sure that a lot of you can also relate to having heard some pretty heavy accounts from your own clients over the years, right? So now that I've introduced myself, I'm going to briefly give you guys a little bit of some background on who we are at Relief. Being based in Oak Brook, we have many locations throughout Illinois, and coming from NAMI in the Northern Illinois sector of things. So Relief Mental Health is an outpatient provider of, we do transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, which is for the treatment of depression, anxiety, OCD, and even smoking cessation. We also offer the nasal spray Spravato S-ketamine, which also treating treatment-resistant depression. And then even in a few of our clinics, we're able to offer an IV ketamine treatment. And then, of course, your standard medication management and therapy services. Again, we have locations all throughout Illinois, a couple up north in Wisconsin, a couple out in New Jersey, and so forth. So that's us in a nutshell there, and I can give you more information if you'd like in the future. Okay. Right, so let's jump right in. What did we come here for? Let's get on the topic of secondary trauma, which is, as I said, a significant concern for professionals in the helping fields. Right now, I'm assuming I'm speaking mostly to therapists and clinicians, social workers, but this topic can even apply to, our first responders and such. So today we're going to take a look at the intricacies of secondary trauma. We're going to explore the signs and the symptoms and the impact that secondary trauma has on those of us individuals who are in these fields, okay? And we are going to kind of branch off at one point here and even discuss a little bit on the impact that secondary trauma has on the loved ones of survivors, so within the families as well, okay? As an audience, my hope is that you are going to acquire a deeper understanding of the different presentations of secondary trauma, the emotional fatigue, detachment, the diminished sense of achievement, things of that nature. We're going to develop the ability to identify the subtle indicators of secondary trauma in yourself, right? So that you're able to nurture an environment that is conducive to early intervention and prevention. So that kind of speaks a little bit to our workplaces. And then, of course, we're going to, in today's presentation, furnish some practical techniques, evidence-based interventions for effectively managing secondary trauma. So ranging from self-care routines to organizational protocols that promote staff well-being. We're going to explore a spectrum of strategies that are going to be designed to alleviate the effects of secondary trauma, okay? So whether you're a seasoned clinician or new to the helping profession, this Lunch and Learn today is going to provide, hopefully, some valuable insights and resources for you to address those challenges. Now, I do have my own story that I'd like to briefly share with you all, just so that you can get a sense of how secondary trauma has the ability to show up in our therapeutic careers. So as I mentioned before, I was working at an employee assistance program. At this timeline, or at this point in time, I was also scheduled to go to the hospital 2-3 days, I was going to have inpatient surgery on my back. So this would have been in April of 2021. Now, I mentioned that date because this was at a time when the pandemic was really no longer at its height at that point in time, but it was obviously going on fairly strong. But we selected the date of April in 2021 because that was when loved ones were allowed to go back, allowed back into the hospital rooms and recovery rooms. So that wasn't, I didn't have to do it by myself, right? Some of you might remember some of that. So right around the same time, when I was at the EAP, I had a client who was scheduled on my caseload. And when she came to me that first time and told me her story of what brought her to seek counseling, she did share about, unfortunately, having lost her husband very suddenly, okay? Now, it is a sad story, but this was one of those situations where here we were in the midst of a pandemic, hospital stay, and we can kind of do the math. And I was about to do the same thing her husband did. Now, at this stage in my career, I've been doing therapy for quite a while. I was used to talking to people through their tears, through their emotions. That kind of thing no longer rattled me, but it was the exclamations that this woman made through her tears that absolutely stuck with me. And because I related so much to her story, not only because I was about to do what her husband had done, but also because my partner would be doing the things that she also was doing for her husband, getting ready to have him back at home, recovering, creating the creature comforts of blankets, TV at the ready, plenty to read at his bedside table, buying him new pajamas, right? And it took me several weeks after that before I stopped hearing her, those ruminations of hearing her sobs about buying him new pajamas. That was kind of going over and over again in my head, right? Now, I'm fine. I had my surgery and everything is good, right? But I'm sure that as clinicians, you also may have had some similar experiences of hearing some stories or narratives from your clients that weren't actually happening to you, but that you still felt the effects of, right? Now, that was my experience with secondary trauma. I didn't experience exactly what that woman had, but I was deeply affected by it. And it pushed me beyond feelings of burnout and exhaustion, and even actually made me wonder if therapy was right for me to continue with, right? So a lot of resources out there will use the terms secondary trauma and even compassion fatigue interchangeably. And there is a lot of overlap with these terms, but I want to make sure that we're aware of that main distinction between secondary trauma and compassion fatigue, okay? Which compassion fatigue is actually better described as the erosion of the compassion that we need, right, to show while working with clients in this field, okay? Whereas secondary trauma really goes beyond the compassion fatigue in that it is the response that occurs when we are impacted by someone else's trauma simply from witnessing it or hearing about it, okay? Right, so like I said, secondary trauma comes from when an individual is indirectly exposed to someone else's trauma. First responder that's treating the injury of a person who's been in an accident and they're kind of seeing the scene around them, or from a therapist who is hearing the traumatic events being relayed by their client. Okay, that prolonged stress of taking on others' trauma can actually lead to symptoms that are similar to PTSD. right? Where the helper themselves might experience those ruminations, maybe even have some of their own nightmares about that situation, or increased worry that traumatic events such as that could or may happen to them. That was part of my experience, okay? So here we can see the differences, right? Compassion fatigue, which typically results over a prolonged period of time, making you feel emotionally exhausted, less empathetic, apathetic, even detached, depressed, and even at sometimes dreading the work that we do. Whereas secondary trauma comes from that exposure, the exposure to the traumatic material. It can come on very suddenly. And again, usually happens for those of us in these types of helping and caregiving roles. And then leaving us to feel things like those ruminating thoughts, again, nightmares, hypervigilance as an impact, and even a heightened startle response, right? So in our previous slide, we saw really only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to secondary trauma symptoms. And here we're seeing what lies below the surface that can actually have some really lasting impacts, right? As helpers, as therapists, it is actually an occupational hazard to be impacted by some of the things that we hear and see, simply because it is within our nature to be empathetic, right? We are empathetic souls. With secondary trauma, it's like that empathy is hitting us harder than it really should, right? But I don't know that a lot of us can get around that, being wired the way that we are. So when we're experiencing secondary trauma, we actually aren't doing really anybody any favors. At this point, we've lost the capacity to provide our support or our expertise that we're being called upon to provide. If we think about it, within the office settings, we risk coming across to our clients as cold and uncaring, because likely at this point in time, we've kind of mentally checked out. That can impact our caseloads, losing business, but even more importantly, affecting our professional ethics, which we tend to kind of, miss a little bit. Our professional ethics of continuing to do work with folks while we're in that state of mind, increasing, of course, our risk of making mistakes. And I truly believe that clients pick up on this. I feel that they do see the shift in our demeanor, and it can very easily and quickly dissolve the trust in that therapeutic rapport, right? Outside of our office settings, it affects us, kind of by harboring this general buzz of irritability, frustration, negative mood, that does really have the potential to impact our own interpersonal relationships. And that, kind of domino effect into creating our own depression, right? So what can we expect to see as an overall impact of secondary trauma? Well, emotionally speaking, we might experience feelings of guilt, anger, numbness, sadness, even helplessness. Cognitively speaking, we might notice some symptoms of low focus, rigidity in our thoughts, maybe even perfectionism kind of sparks here. This is where those ruminations will occur. Obviously, that's a cognitive thing. Behaviorally speaking, we might begin to isolate, experience some sleep disturbances, maybe even some changes in our appetite. And then here's where the hypervigilance shows up. And then physically speaking, those physiological symptoms, increased heart rate, maybe shortness of breath, heightened pain response. Maybe you're kind of getting sick, noticing that the low immune systems, and then startle response, as I mentioned previously as well, right? So quite a list of symptoms of secondary trauma, if I say so. So how to address this, right? So the good news here is that there is hope in finding relief in addressing the secondary trauma. Good news, right? It doesn't actually have to be the ending of our helping careers, as I actually thought it was for myself after my experience. I actually wondered, how often or how many more times can I hear stuff like this without it really, denting me? But with supportive work environments that have the ability to maintain, accessibility to supervision, consultation, things of this nature, we do gain a sense of normalcy because, typically our supervisors are able to share with us, hey, yeah, I've been there before myself, and there is coming out on the other side. Okay, great. Establishing support at home is important and helpful as well. Right now, of course, we can't come home and tell our spouses or our loved ones all of the details. That would be a breach of confidentiality, but we don't have to be completely sealed vaults either. Okay. And that part kind of speaks to self-care. It's I need to take care of myself by, fill in the blank. And that's you really naming the self-care that you intend to participate in, after a particularly trying day. And of course, with a regular practice of self-care will come resilience. I talk about resilience a lot in a lot of different topics. It really is that proper amount of self-care that supports us in being able to bounce back from these situations that we hear about, okay? With that proper level of resilience that I truly feel that we really need in these fields in order to effectively do these jobs, right? And of course, don't forget, about your own therapy, right? I think it's really essential for us to, in building that resiliency, giving ourselves that outlet, right? So to briefly run through healthy work environments, I think a lot of us are familiar with what this looks like, but a healthy work environment really can foster a good sense of camaraderie, cooperation among staff members, right? And there's a lot of different ways that employers can play their part in instilling and investing in their mental health, the mental health of their employees. And these are just a couple to name a few, right? Collaboration and teamwork are really essential to creating healthy workplaces, particularly within the helping fields. I think we really do need to know that we have each other's backs, right? I know that my colleagues have my back and vice versa. Being able to collaborate. Collaboration is, obviously coming together to solve problems, support one another in order to meet our clients' needs, okay? Appropriate staffing, I think, piggybacks off of this, as it really is necessary to make sure that we have the appropriate number of staff to address the needs of the clientele being served. This is particularly true within our community mental health systems, right? If the staff is spread too thin or asked to work longer hours or, take less time off, this is where we are increasing the risk and the prevalence of being exposed to secondary trauma, right? And getting little to no time to recover from it. And we've probably heard this adage before, just like with an injury, it is necessary to allow it to properly heal before using it again in order to avoid re-injury, right? If we're putting our staff back on the front lines before they've even had a chance to process the secondary trauma that happened, well, high turnover rates are going to increase. And then finally, our staff recognition. I'm a huge component of staff recognition because it really does go a long way with building and maintaining morale. And morale is really important for those of us who not only have that risk of exposure to secondary trauma, but simply for the energy, right? I'm sure you guys can agree with this, the energy that it takes to hold space for our clients who are going through difficult times, right? So any managers who are able and willing to acknowledge that, I think is doing a great job of fostering a healthy work environment. All right, support at home, right? As I said before, despite our confidentiality rules, we do not have to be completely shut down with our spouses and our families after our tough day at work, right? But communication really is key. So communicate with your family that when a workday is particularly taxing, it's not that you're angry with them, but rather maybe even set up agreements that sometimes you're going to be coming home from work after witnessing or even hearing a particularly upsetting narrative, and you're going to need to decompress. Right now, agreements around how much time that might require is going to be helpful if you're able to do so. Okay. I can shoot a quick text on my way home. This was a rough one. Give me about 30 minutes before we go into deep conversation. But certainly don't isolate yourself, right? Sometimes it really is our loved ones that we need after hearing these narratives that help us to kind of bounce back, right? These are our friends, our loved ones can really be a good springboard for coming out of that heavy, deep feeling into a more uplifting and fun energy. Right now, as we know, isolation is only going to help to intensify our feelings of dread and depression, as I mentioned before, right? So let's watch for the isolation as well. Okay. So, like I said, I know I'm kind of going through this addressing secondary trauma as we the helpers, but I did want to come off onto a little tangent here and discuss how secondary trauma does impact loved ones at home, since I'm on that support at home branch here. Okay. So what if, right? What if you are not the helper or the therapist experiencing the secondary trauma from a client relationship? What if you, or maybe even one of your clients, is the loved one of somebody who has experienced the secondary trauma themselves, right? So we want to know how we can support these folks. Okay. So first, how does secondary trauma affect families in general? It really can have a profound impact on not only the dynamics of our families of origin, but also can have a profound impact on our relationships of the future, friendships, and maybe even more so likely our romantic relationships, right? Because secondary trauma can, even subconsciously, right, influence our partner selection or even the selections we make for those people that we surround ourselves with, right, our friends. I know I mentioned this before briefly, trauma, symptoms of PTSD, they really do have a way of sneaking up on us. Our closest loved ones, whether it be our immediate family or our best friends or romantic partners, these are all people in our lives that we typically allow to see all sides of ourselves, even and maybe even especially when we're not at our best, right? So it would make sense that our closest loved ones would be the ones who see the manifestations of any trauma or PTSD responses that come up for us, even ones that are later on in life. Okay. People who have experienced trauma will often carry with them feelings of guilt, shame, lowered self-esteem, anger, anxiety, depression, right? All of these things will directly dictate how we as humans interact and relate to other humans. Okay, so relationally speaking, parents might place blame on themselves for not doing enough to protect their child from the traumatic event that has occurred. This can result in ruminations about what they could have done differently to prevent it. Parental relationships can become strained when the parents aren't certain of how to support their child, and when the child is themselves not even certain of the kind of support that they need from their parent. With children, they may be asked to grow up faster than they really should, say if it was the parent who has gone through the traumatic event. This is called role reversal, and I'm going to get more into that in here in just a minute. Within sibling relationships, right, especially younger siblings, they might internalize what they see from their older affected sibling. In other words, they might take their siblings' isolation to mean that they don't want to be around them or spend time with them, kind of making it their fault. They might feel as though their sibling that they're angry with them, right? Additionally, some siblings who are closer in age might relate enough to their sibling that they feel as though, hey, that event could have happened to me, or it might happen to me in the future, right? I don't want to go to that party because I don't want the same thing to happen to me that happened to my sister. Right? Within our friendships, a similar aspect can happen, as I mentioned, with the younger sibling to the older sibling. Right, for example, in my own personal life, there was a time frame where a close friend of mine who, she got into the habit of frequently declining, canceling plans. And after a while, I began to think that it was something that I had done. Now, of course, we stuck with it, right? I hung in there. And I did later come to learn that her isolation was more a result of what she was going through in her own life. Okay, it's hard. We want to take things personally, but we have to practice not. Within our partnerships, in the case of relationships, trust is often affected following traumatic events. The individual who experienced the trauma might feel distrustful that their partner will be able to hold space for them emotionally, or they might feel as though they want to avoid putting their partner through, right, I'm going to use the B word, the burden of providing the support they need. And therefore, they don't quite trust their partner to help in the ways that they need, okay? Very commonly, survivors of trauma will feel as though they're broken, unwhole, even unworthy of love. And I think it's important that we're showing them that is not the case. Okay. So the main effects that secondary trauma has on our loved ones would include survivor's guilt, emotional contagion, role reversals, and dependency. And I'm going to go into each of these individually here quickly. Okay, so starting with survivor's guilt. What is it? Okay, this term can actually be defined in a couple of different ways. Most directly, survivor's guilt refers to the feeling of guilt that comes when an individual survives a traumatic event, but others don't. Okay, survivor's guilt can also refer to feeling guilty for not having gone through the traumatic event that your loved one went through. So not even having been there at all. Okay, it's that why them instead of me mentality that pops up. This typically is coupled with the feeling that They should have done more to prevent the event from happening in the first place, like I mentioned before, which is common with parents. And then additionally, some people do feel a great sense of guilt if they survive, but their rescuer unfortunately didn't, right? Survivor's guilt can have profound impacts. Folks who experience survivor's guilt will likely be impacted by feelings of helplessness, in that they were unable to help alter the outcome of the situation. Irritability can become a common factor, as that helplessness can easily morph into self-anger, which is then turned outward toward others, resulting in angry outbursts. This has the impact of, again, I'm going to use this ruminating word a lot, but that's what happened, ruminating about the event, about the actions that were taken or not taken, etc., right? Which could, even eventually lead to a lack of sleep. These thoughts about those thoughts about how a survivor may have been able to predict or even alter the outcome of any event is what we call hindsight bias. I'm sure you've heard that phrase before. And this cycle can easily repeat itself over and over again, right? Another effect of this with family members is what's called emotional contagion. So what is that? According to the National Council for Mental Well-Being, 70% of US adults have experienced a traumatic event at least once in their lives. Now, of course, that number, as we can all guess, is really only reflective of what has been reported. And I bring that statistic up because, unfortunately, a lot of people can relate to the implications and emotions that come up after experiencing a traumatic event. Okay. So that is a form of emotional contagion. Another form of emotional contagion, right? You ever be in a good mood, walking through your day, going through it, and then somebody who is in a bad mood, you come into contact with them, and now all of a sudden you're also in a bad mood? Emotional contagion. Okay, so what happens to one triggers similar emotions in somebody else. Okay, emotional contagion. With this comes that the impact of emotional synchrony, which is when our loved ones might start to mirror the survivor's emotions. Another impact is emotional distress. Okay. Anxiety, hypervigilance, depression, and then strained relationships can occur, okay, as a result of those emotions kind of feeding off of each other, leading to conflicts, misunderstandings, things of that nature. Okay, I mentioned role reversals before. This is pretty straightforward. We're looking at examples of this being role reversals between parent and child. Maybe now all of a sudden the child in the household is being given more responsibilities when it used to be the parents' responsibilities. Things like cooking, cleaning, even sometimes taking care of their other siblings. Sibling to sibling role reversals, very similar. Maybe instead of our chores being split up, I'm doing all of them. And then spousal role reversals, where one spouse might have to take on all of the household responsibilities, even childcare, again, that were once divided. What's the impact of this? Well, aside from simply exhaustion, burnout, eventually resentment, we're looking at feelings of overwhelm, feeling unprepared for these new responsibilities. Identity and self-esteem are impacted because we're taking on unfamiliar roles in the role reversal aspect. And then, of course, resentment and guilt become major players here, as oftentimes family members might experience resentment toward their survivor loved one. And then on top of that is layered the guilt for feeling that burden in the first place. right? I feel bad for feeling this way. And then, as I mentioned, dependency issues, okay? This happens a lot when it comes to secondary trauma in the household. Emotionally speaking, our survivors will lean heavily on other family members for that reassurance, emotional validation, and stability. Physically speaking, we might rely on our loved ones when it comes to, help with daily activities and all of the things I mentioned in our last slide. And then financially, we're looking at, that kind of dependency that happens when, say, the survivor is unable to work and they need their family or their spouse's financial support. Very similarly to the impact of role reversals, dependency can lead to burnout, compassion fatigue, loss of personal time, like not able to spend time on our own pursuits, our own hobbies, our own social lives, even education. That could lead to isolation of the family members. And then we're also looking at stunted recovery in this category here, that over dependency hindering the survivor's recovery process as they might not develop or even maintain necessary life skills of independence due to the enabling that's going on, right? So how can we provide support, and how can we as therapists encourage our clients who might be these family members to provide support? For one thing, we want to empower the survivors, right? Therapists and loved ones alike can provide encouragement to the survivor to take, start with small, manageable steps in regaining that independence. Making sure that our family members of survivors know how to set boundaries. So we're going to work with these clients to communicate their limits. That way we can avoid that compassion fatigue. We can, hopefully create a healthy balance of support. We want to normalize these situations, normalize how the client is feeling, whether it be that they're feeling guilty, making sure they know that it doesn't mean that they are guilty. And the flip side of that it is okay to also feel okay and even happy again after a traumatic event happened, right? Support groups is another great source of providing help and resources. Encouraging healthy communication, right, which is going to foster the ability to express their feelings. And then I mentioned therapy before, being able to make sure that if it's not one of our clients that they are in, that they have access to therapy. Okay. I'm going to speed through this self-care slide. I feel like as clinicians, if most of you out here are clinicians, you kind of have an idea of what self-care looks like. I always define it to my clients as really literally anything you're doing because you've chosen to do it, and because you've chosen to do it, it must feel good. Okay. Things like meditation, getting out in nature really helps. We know that nature helps to reduce cortisol, or the stress hormone in our brains. We can teach grounding techniques, or I should say practice grounding techniques, and then engaging in relaxation. Okay, so self-care actually is bringing us back to how we as clinicians and we as therapists who kind of come up against secondary trauma can help to prevent it. Okay, so this is kind of refocusing back on ourselves, although it helps anybody, in my opinion, right? As I mentioned before, following self-care, excuse me, I'm sorry. I want to skip this slide. Here it goes. We want to jump into resiliency skills. Okay. So what does that look like? How do we build resiliency? Now, a lot of resiliency does stem from how we care for ourselves. So anything you're doing with self-care is actually building resilience. Okay. So keep that in mind. But we also, I often give this example of be a window. Okay, well, Jay, what does that mean? So if you imagine a window, it has the screen, right? The glass pane, blinds, maybe even curtains, okay? And so if you're practicing this notion of being a window, you get to choose how open or how closed the window is. Do you have everything wide open, maybe just the screen is closed? Well, a lot can get through that screen, okay? Or do you keep the screen down and the window pane down? You're got some protection between you, but you can still hear, you can still see through it. Okay, now as clinicians, we probably aren't ever going to be able to close our windows all the way up to the curtain. That's probably never going to be an option for us because we wouldn't really be able to help if that was the case, right? But depending on the situation that you're working with, depending on the client that you're working with, make sure that you're taking care of yourself, protecting yourself from letting a lot of that heavy emotion come through. Okay. So how open or closed do you want your window to be, okay, as you're addressing these issues? Just my little analogy with that one. I oftentimes think about that for myself as a clinician. Now, of course, we want to stay connected. Like I said before, isolation really being the, to use a big word here, antithesis, I love that word, of resilience, right? When you remain connected with others who understand you and the work that you do, you are going to increase your support network. Okay, so that's a really good way of building resilience, that self-care, being in control of what you're allowing to soak in and what you're not, as well as staying connected. Okay. And now, speaking of staying connected, I have a few resources here. Some of these look very familiar to you on how we can stay connected. I do truly believe that as therapists, it really is helpful for us to have our own therapy to look forward to. So you're kind of cutting things off at the pass if you're able to know that, wow, after this trying week I've had, I'm so glad that I have my own appointment to talk to my therapist. So I've added these resources here. Psychology Today, I'm sure we're all familiar with. That's pretty straightforward. We have Good Therapy, which that is located at the URL pops up here. Goodtherapy.org to find a therapist. Okay. I included Mental Health Match, located at mentalhealthmatch.com. I included the CPTSD Foundation in this resource just because I've been talking a lot about PTSD and trauma. So that's located at cptsdfoundation.org. Findatherapist.com, pretty straightforward. And then finally, Mental Health America as another resource, which is at mhanational.org. Okay. So you guys I can get these websites to you again if need be, but I wanted to make sure I gave you plenty of resources for if you don't have a therapist and want to find one, there's some good resources there. Okay. So that's about it. You know, like I said before, secondary trauma for therapists really, realistically might not be completely unavoidable, but it also does not have to be our demise. So hopefully you guys are able to kind of see the signs and put some strategies to it. I want to give the last 10 minutes here to open it up to any questions, comments, etc. that you might have. Hopefully I didn't go too fast, but I'm opening the floor.
Jay, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation that was not only interesting and engaging, but I think it's very helpful to those of us in the helping professions. There is a question in the chat box. It says, this is a really great presentation. Will the recording of the presentation and the PDFs and slides be available after the presentation, please? And I know that we do have the recording going up to the cloud. We'll be downloading that and putting it on NAMI Northern Illinois' YouTube page. Would you be able to send us a PDF of the presentation slides, Jay?
Yes, I can do that. I have Danielle's email readily available. I can do that and send them to her. Probably by the beginning of next week, I can get that to you guys.
Terrific.
Yeah,
And that is also the way that people will get their CEU credit.
good.
Um, we have quite a few participants out there.
Yes, very good.
Yeah, I really appreciate everybody being so attentive, and your presentation was really down to earth, and you explained everything very well.
Good, good. Were there any other questions?
I see one new message come in. Let's see. It says, will you have to complete a survey? I think there is an evaluation that Danielle's going to send to all the participants, and I think you return that. I think the survey basically consists of, yes, I do want CEU credit, so I don't think it's a very difficult one to complete.
Well, that's good.
Okay. Well, if I think the problem is that you explained everything
I
so
must have. Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. I must have gone through so thoroughly. But good. I guess that's a good problem to have.
yeah, that's a good sign. Not a lot of questions popped up for me. Um, the only thing is, yeah, is secondary trauma only limited to therapists, or can family members actually experience secondary trauma as well?
Well, yeah, and it is so that being so true, the reason why I needed to kind of branch off and address that, because it does come in those two forms. The one that I described is I shared my own personal story with it as a clinician. That's how it showed up. But yes, absolutely, as family members were experiencing secondary trauma, particularly in the households after a traumatic event happens. Yeah,
Mhm.
it
And
has
certainly,
that ability. Yeah.
yeah, and I like the way that you separated it from compassion fatigue, because I'm sure
Mm.
families experience compassion fatigue as well. Just the day-to-day grind of having to provide all those services, and I'm sure that leads to secondary trauma where you're more guilty about needing help, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I think that your example was very telling, very,
Good. Yeah.
very good.
It's hard, right? I mean, it's a hard thing to go through and it's a hard thing to experience, but I want to make sure that if I'm going to talk about this topic, I want to be able to talk about it. So I think it's important. I do see another question here. I was able to open the chat. Uh,
Hmm.
what would be a good boundary to help prevent secondary trauma? So, and I guess this depends on, are you referring to as the clinician? So maybe a boundary might be, um, as we become seasoned clinicians, this is a little bit more prevalent in our careers. We might be able to be a little bit more, as time goes on, a little bit more discretionary on the type of demographics we work in, right? So I might have a boundary for myself of, I'm not going to work in, a particular setting because I would become more. Okay, I'll give you this example. Maybe I wouldn't do crisis work because those are more acute situations where I'm going to be more in the face of those crisis kind of calls. So that might be a boundary, just depending on like what facet or what kind of branch of mental health I want to work in could be a boundary. When we look at boundaries within families, if I'm a family member of a survivor of a trauma, for example, a good boundary to set with that might be something to the effect of, I will help you with these things and for this long, but at the same time, I'm also going to support you in maintaining those skills as best as you can, and not completely losing them would be a good example of that. For the sake of time, I hope I answered that question for this. Who is that, for Tiffany? Is
Hmm.
that for Tiffany or no, for Amanda? Okay.
Right.
So, yeah.
And then Tiffany does comment about the
The
analogy of
window.
using a window,
Yeah.
uh, having a screen, maybe some curtains.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Right.
but
Yeah.
yeah, my boss has been wise to talk about not being available 24/7.
That's another good boundary. Absolutely.
Yeah, especially
Fantastic boundary.
with social media and all of the different places we can get messages from. Um, yeah, it's so easy to be bombarded 24/7
Absolutely.
with requests for help.
Yeah, absolutely. Even adding at the bottom of your email, the signature. This email is only checked between these hours of these days, and if there is an emergency, here's your resources, 988, et cetera, et cetera. That's another really good boundary.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, here's another one from Lynette. It says, how can I help a family create boundaries with regard to an adult transgender daughter living at home and dependency issues and secondary trauma and compassion fatigue? Help a family create boundaries.
Wow, Lynette, I think you've just given a really fantastic idea for another presentation. But I think this one is I think as the clinician here, it's important to um, communication, communication strategies, communication techniques, things of that nature. How can we communicate to the daughter what is expected of the household? Right. And I would say, even regardless of identity, there is a certain set of rules and expectations for any household. Right. So letting, teaching or coaching your client how to communicate what those expectations are, and even why. We have the boundary of your room is a certain way, or we have the boundary. I'm kind of assuming that this is a young individual, maybe early teens or something, but grades might be a boundary for certain reasons, things of that nature. Oh, if person is 27, okay, that's a different ball game. Right? Do we have a boundary that you're working? How many hours are you working? How are you contributing to the household? And then this is tough, because when we get to boundary talk, it turns into, if these boundaries aren't met, then, right? If these expectations aren't met, then. And
Mhm.
that's really goes back to what I call the good old fashioned tough love. And it's hard, because it's hard to have these kind of conversations with our adult children who what, hey, what do you need, or what do you want to learn about before, so that you feel comfortable? This kind of seems like a launching issue, or it could be a launching issue, so that you feel comfortable to launch those kind of things. But Lynette, I would say that this is really a communication issue. How do we communicate?
And I really agree with your earlier statement. I hope I'm not overstepping by saying that sounds like a great opportunity for another follow-on lunch and learn, because
Yeah.
with 2 minutes left, I think the whole idea of what's going on with society and issues
Mm,
about gender and all of that, I'm sure adds an additional layer of stress to all of us in America.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
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 Well,
And
you're
boundaries and expectations in and of itself it could be a completely a full hour on its own, for sure. But Lynette, thanks for the idea.
all right, Jay. So you've signed up for 2 more sessions. I love
Right.
it. All right. Well, if anyone has any additional questions or um, just ideas for further topics you'd like to see in one of our Leading the Conversation lunch and learn sessions, please send your questions to info@naminorthernillinois.org, um, or check out our website, naminorthernillinois.org. Jay, thanks once again for a wonderful presentation, and we'll look forward to having, or having people check out our YouTube page probably next week to see this
Wonderful.
presentation.
Great. Perfect.
Thank you,
All right.
everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all. Appreciate your attention.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.